Formula One is back, ladies and gentlemen, and so is Grid Chat. As you guys know, I have missed race recaps, and we are finally back thanks to the very chaotic Australian Grand Prix. So welcome back to Grid Chat. I am your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going to be recapping the Australian Grand Prix. We're going to do things a little bit differently this season, because as much as this podcast is called Grid Chat, and we have a group chat where we all talk about the race and watch the races together, I want that to also be a part of the podcast. So starting with this episode, after I go through my feelings, my commentary on the race, what I think it means for the rest of the season, all of the fun stuff that we normally go through, I'm also going to be going through the questions that you guys send from the race, as well as your reactions, your hot takes, your predictions for next race, and for all of 2025. A ton of you guys responded because I think this race was a pretty intense one, and so I'm pretty excited. We're going to go through all of that at the end of this episode. But let's get started with the race recap first. Before we dive into the race itself, which as we all know was maybe one of the most chaotic that we've had in a long time, I want to talk about the stuff that started the weekend out. You guys may know that I was actually in Kansas City for the Big Ten tournament for like a good portion of this weekend. And so this was maybe one of the most chaotic viewing experiences that I've had in a long time, because I watched free practice 1 at my house right before I finished packing for the flight. And then I watched free practice 2 in the airport lounge right before my flight boarded. And then free practice 3 I had to watch on delay. Quali I watched in my hotel room right after I had come back from the Big 12 tournament in Kansas City, which also I walked back from the stadium to my hotel room and there were wildfires and crazy wind. So it was like kind of like walking through a weird version of Wicked before I could get back and watch quali. And then I did make it back home to watch the race from my own couch. So I sort of feel I was a big part of the chaos as well. All of that being said, I think we all had some pretty big expectations coming into this season after the end of last season. Some of the big storylines we had coming into the season that I think we're going to be focused on included the fact that we had 5 rookies on the grid, how Lando Norris and Max Verstappen would stack up against each other, whether Red Bull had built a car to compete with McLaren, whether McLaren would come out swinging and maintain the dominance that they started to show at the end of last season, a conversation about Lewis Hamilton moving to Ferrari and whether or not he could possibly adjust to this new car. And then I think there were 2 very clear pairs of drivers that we were going to see being talked about as like kind of whether or not one of them was better than the other. And those were Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson, and our 2 McLaren drivers, Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. And I think all of those kind of storylines were definitely touched on this week. Even before we get into the racing, we can talk about a couple of those things. Lewis Hamilton, for one, and his adjustment to Ferrari, even just talking prior to the race starting. I will say that obviously Lewis did not outperform Charles Leclerc this weekend, but we also saw a pretty clear understanding of the fact that he has his head focused and he is planning to adjust to this whole new situation, that the Ferrari setup is incredibly different from the Mercedes setup. And one of the other things that we learned during commentary, during free practice, and it was also mentioned during the race, was the fact that Lewis's steering wheel is set up incredibly different from the steering wheel that he had at Mercedes now that he's moved over to Ferrari. They mentioned that there is a mode he can press to kind of mirror his setup from his Mercedes car, and that slowly but surely we'll see him move over to the Ferrari preferred setup as he gets comfortable with the car. And I think when you actually look at the numbers, the learning curve is actually working pretty well. As much as this was not a perfect weekend for Lewis, and Lewis and Charles Leclerc and Ferrari did not just come out swinging and look so amazing that we thought, oh, this is going to be their year, the way that a lot of us always wish that it would be, we did see that Lewis is within a couple of tenths of Charles Leclerc in his pace. And so I think as we look at this, we're going to see Ferrari figure out those bumps, and we'll see this team start to gel in a way that is hopeful. But as we saw in the race, I think we know that that's going to take some work and some effort. However, one of the things that I think was really clear from the very beginning across free practice and qualifying is that Lewis is incredibly happy to be at Ferrari. He continues to talk about it as though there's this like first day of school feeling coming out of him. His dad is there and is so happy, and Lewis just can't take the smile off of his face. And in general, we didn't even hear this big competitive nature of feeling like Charles Leclerc was performing better than him or anything like that. We heard him very honestly talk about the fact that his teammate has been on this team for so long, that he's so comfortable with the car, that there's things that he can learn from Charles and from the team, and that it's going to take an adjustment period. But it was not this like defeated kind of sad Lewis version that we were starting to see when he was having trouble at Mercedes last year. This is instead like a kid who had all of his dreams come true, and despite not being completely perfect out of the gate, is really focused in on making this a perfect union. So did we come out and just see this like perfect domination of Lewis and Ferrari and this a beautiful pairing and everything's going to be fine? No, we didn't. And we didn't even really see that during like free practice sessions or quali either. I think it's clear that there are some adjustments that need to be made to the car and that the team needs some time to gel and figure out this new version of themselves, especially given that they were both out qualified by both a V-Carb and a Williams. Next, this conversation of, does McLaren have what it takes to remain dominant? dominant. Yeah, pretty clearly, even just from free practice, we were seeing them put in these great laps, and in quali we saw a 1-2 for Lando and Oscar. And remember, this is Oscar's home race too. And we saw both of these drivers pushing each other to be faster with each lap. And so we'll get into a little bit of this when we talk about the race itself, but I do think McLaren has found a way to kind of balance these two drivers, has kept the dominance of their car and improved it. And if they can manage everything properly, there's a pretty strong case for them being contenders. And then let's talk rookies. Because going into this season, one of the biggest expectations was the fact that we have 5 rookies hitting the grid at the exact same time. One slight technicality to explain for this portion of the episode, Liam Lawson, technically speaking, is not a rookie this year. Because of his stint with V-Carb last year, as well as the stint previously where he was racing for Daniel Ricciardo when he had broken his wrist, Liam has actually exceeded the number of races allowed to be considered a rookie. Because of that, that's why Liam wasn't in the rookie interview, and that's why we're saying there's 5 rookies this season instead of 6. However, for the purposes of our discussion, I feel like he should be included in the rookie conversation, especially because his current situation is so contentious, and it feels unfair to say that he is an experienced driver when it's literally just over the limit of what would be considered a rookie. So that being said, I'm going to include Liam Lawson in our conversations when we're talking about rookies all year. Due to inexperience and getting started, a lot of times rookies can cause chaos, and the idea that 25% of the grid would be first-time, full-time Formula One drivers was definitely an expectation of chaos. But also, just talking about free practice sessions and quali, I think we should go through these rookies and see what everything looked like based off of what we were expecting them to do. Because coming into the season, 3 of these rookies were heavily discussed and had pretty big expectations. Kimi Antonelli, as we know, his debut coming into Mercedes was such a contentious one. This idea that Lewis Hamilton's contract was not extended in the way that he wanted it to be because Toto Wolff was pretty sure that Kimi Antonelli was going to be this next great kid and that he wanted to make sure that he had the space and the options to do this. Plus this idea that Kimi Antonelli has the chance to be the youngest race winner ever, beating out Max Verstappen, and that he was just so young and kind of almost cherubic. I think my favorite description of Kimi Antonelli is this idea that he would be like what it would happen if you gave Peter Parker a race car. I think that is incredibly true, and you can really feel it, right? But coming into the season, I think he had so much pressure to be perfect. And I think we were all not sure if he was going to be able to hold on to those expectations. Then you have Ollie Behrman, who has this big heroic moment last year where he's able to come in for Carlos Sainz during the appendicitis, drive a Ferrari through a race and score points. And his seat was highly expected. And also, I think a lot of people forgot that we had already seen him on a lot of free practice schedules for Haas at the beginning of the season. And so I think his expectation of moving into Formula One was already there before his big hero edit with Carlos. But obviously he did move into that space and he did have that edit. So there was this expectation that he would be doing so well. And then lastly, we have Liam Lawson. And I think the issue here is that Liam kind of got set up to fail, at least in the eyes of the public, not necessarily in the eyes of Formula One or his actual career or where he's going. But I think he had one of the most brutal fan introductions to this sport because you have him coming in last year and replacing Daniel Ricciardo mid-season, one of the most beloved drivers on the grid, in a way that we didn't even see Daniel Ricciardo go to Texas, which is one of his biggest races, and with this really big expectation that he has to be worth getting rid of this driver who's incredibly valuable to Red Bull in terms of PR and fan base, and also was an incredibly good driver throughout his career. So Lawson comes in this really rough period where it's like, okay, you're getting rid of someone that a lot of people really like, and you're replacing him with someone that people don't seem to love, especially because he comes in pretty hot. We have these moments on track where he flips off Checo Perez, where Fernando Alonso can't stand him. He's not really making friends as he comes in last year. And then, of course, getting the Red Bull seat was a pretty contentious situation because a lot of people felt like Yuki Tsunoda deserved that seat. He had been a part of the team for longer, he had grown with the team, and he had done kind of what was asked of him to perform. And so I think Liam has this high level of expectation from the fan base, from the team, and already kind of an unfair, I would say, opinion of him as a person, just from the fan base and who they lost because they got Liam. I think hopefully there's been a little bit of a shift in that in terms of public opinion. I've seen a lot of people really enjoy the fact that he loves cars as much as he does, like the movie, not like cars that he drives. He does drive cars. I assume he likes cars, but also the movie Cars. Lightning McQueen is his, big hero. We're seeing more and more likability from him, and I think that has been really good for him. But I think he was coming into this race with a lot of expectations to live up to. And then on the flip side, we have 3 other rookies who don't necessarily have the same level of expectation from the fan base. I think every team expects you to do well, and every driver driver wants to do well, but there has not been as much PR or kind of big storylines around these guys. Those were Isack Hadjar, Gabriel Bortoleto, and Jack Doohan. And so I think, to be fair, those three came in with a little bit less pressure than the other three. And let's talk about just pre-race how these rookies kind of stood up to each other. Ollie Behrman, I think, had the roughest weekend when we talk about not the race included. We have him crash out in free practice 1, miss free practice 2 so the team can rebuild his car, and crash out in like minutes in free practice 3. And then because of that, he misses qualifying. This was a really big bummer for me, just in general. I felt really bad for the kid, but I also felt like there was this weird version where I was surprised that this was going on for him, because quite frankly, he did show a lot of promise last year, and he felt like one of the rookies who really was prepared. He's had a lot of experience. He's had experience in a better car with Ferrari, and he's had really good mentors and like this expectation of moving forward for a bit. I think also, like I mentioned, he's had a lot of time in the car. We knew that he was kind of planning to move up. And so I was surprised to see him struggle as hard as he did in free practice, because also what's rough is that last year Haas had their first profitable year ever. And it's hard to turn around and have your very first session end in crash damage, skip your second session, and have your third session once again end in crash damage. So for Ollie, in terms of his expectations there, I'm not sure that he really lived up to them. Then we have Liam Lawson, and Liam, to be honest, was at the back of the pack the entire weekend. Practice sessions, there was never really anything extraordinary, and then he qualifies 18th. He is out in Q1. And I think while that could have happened to any rookie, it's incredibly difficult when you're being compared against a driver who did not do that. Yuki Tsunoda was in a V-carb and qualified 5th. And I do want to point out the fact that like after qualifying, he did talk about the idea that he got a tow, that he was lucky, it was a lucky lap, everything kind of lined up, but it was also a really good lap. And what I think is really interesting is that Yuki's feelings and kind of his approach to life has changed. I think when he had been asked this question before, the instant response would have been, yeah, I deserved this seat better. Liam was out in Q1. I am so much more suited to have that seat. But instead he was humble. He was pretty honest about how he felt. He brought up the toe, and yeah, he qualified P5. And there was a heartwarming moment where we saw Isack, who had already been knocked out, kind of in the back cheering for Yuki when he hit P5. And I think kind of surprisingly, the two of them are going to be a good lineup for V-carb. I think Isack has a lot of the same flaws that Yuki had when he was younger, and Yuki's the right driver to kind of help Isack get through that, teach him to be a little bit more humble and a little bit more like willing to work with the team. And Isack, I think, was just, happy to be here. Jack Doohan kind of flew under the radar, made it out of Q1, got knocked out in Q2, qualified 14th. Altogether, not a bad show for him. He was only about 5 slots away from his teammate, Pierre Gasly. And I think for him, honestly, the ideal situation for a rookie is to just quietly make it through everything. Again, pre-race, we'll get into the race itself later. And then lastly, on the rookie front, I have to be honest with you, I was so happy for Gabriel Bortoleto. When he knocked out Kimi Antonelli, I thought, okay, great. You know what? We have barely heard anything about this kid. He got so little press. And again, one of the only responses he got for his driver announcement was the fact that it was like a super quick turnaround time behind when they announced that neither Valtteri nor Zhou would be continuing this season. And so I was happy to see him have his moment. I think Gabriel Bortoleto has a lot of talent, and I think that we saw a little bit of that this weekend. And I think for the rookies, we really only have free practice and qualifying to talk about to really compare them and show where their talent lays and where they're starting out. So that wraps up our rookies and most of our kind of before the race itself started. But obviously we were heading into this race with a 1-2 for McLaren, with Max Verstappen right behind them in a Red Bull in 3rd, George Russell in 4th, and then very shockingly, Yuki Tsunoda in 5th and Alex Albon in 6th. For both of them, I was especially proud to see them that high up. And also it was really exciting to see 2 midfield teams competing at that level. And then especially for Alex, when we have all of this conversation about Carlos Sainz being ready to be way better than him, there's no way he's going to be a big part of this team anymore. He's totally lost his edge. Out qualifies Carlos. And that takes us into the race itself. This race honestly was so chaotic that at times it felt like we were under more safety car conditions than we were racing conditions. But unfortunately, there was chaos even before the race started. Isack Hadjar, the rookie for V-carb, goes into the wall during the formation lap. And it's important to note that not only is this track difficult, it's also completely raining. It's soaked. And rainy conditions can be some of the most difficult as a driver, depending on your skill set, but especially if you're a new driver. It's one of the more difficult things to run practice in. And it's even something Lewis Hamilton talked about, saying that he was not comfortable with the Ferrari in a wet track, saying that before the race itself after qualifying. So for the 6 drivers who were new to the track, and I'm including Liam Lawson in that because even though he had the experience with the V-carb last year, this was his first time with a Red Bull on a wet track, or at least his first time in racing conditions in a Red Bull on a wet track. And I think what's important to recognize is that these are really hard conditions to get started in, especially for your very first race with the pressure that's already there. So when we look at Isack and the fact that he goes out in just the very beginning of the race, before the race even starts, in the formation lap, it was an incredibly devastating scenario and I felt so bad for him. But it also led to a really important moment to me from this weekend. After Isack crashed, we saw him walking around being followed by the media and being so visibly upset that he left his helmet on. And this is something we see in motorsports when a driver has a scenario like this where it's just pretty gut-wrenching and they're pretty emotional about it. You'll see them leave their helmet on. And a lot of times that's because they know that they're going to be passing cameras. They know that footage is going to be taken of them. They know that fans are going to take pictures. There's not really any privacy in that moment right after a very emotional situation. And it's kind of the only semblance of sort of privacy and dignity that these drivers can afford for themselves. And even so, even with that privacy, it was very visibly clear that Isack was crying, mostly because he cut a pretty sad figure. He's walking with his head down, just looking at his feet, and he has his visor open with his hand in his visor. And honestly, it was really hard to watch. Like, Isack is 20 years old. He's finally accomplished this lifelong dream. And I know a lot of my listeners are pretty new to Formula One. And so even if you aren't new to Formula One, I do want to remind you, like, the journey to Formula One is a lifelong commitment. This is something that not only Isack has committed to since he was a kid, but something that his family has had to support him through and to try to kind of financially support him through on top of that. This sport requires you to be comfortable leaving your home at a young age, to give up a lot of your classic childhood kind of milestones, for your family to be okay with that, and for your family to sacrifice alongside you to make that dream possible. I'm not a parent, but I also can't imagine what it's like for a parent to realize that their kid has this kind of talent and could have this kind of like career, and to realize what it takes to support them through that. And then to actually make that commitment, make it all the way to Formula One, and through just the worst possible conditions. Isack makes a mistake that 5 other drivers end up making later that race. And just like that, the debut to his dreams coming true is over before it even started. I think when you properly put this into context, this is rightfully so one of the most devastating moments that this kid is going through in his life. And so we have a very heartwarming moment where Anthony Hamilton, who is Lewis Hamilton's father, intercepts Isack while he's walking and holds him in an embrace, really. And if you watched the footage while the race was happening, like on the broadcast I was watching on F1 TV, you can see that Isack is actually so lost that he doesn't even notice that Anthony Hamilton has like stepped into his path, and Anthony has to catch him to keep him from tripping and to hold him in that way, because Isack is just so locked in on his feet, just trying to move forward. And then what follows is just this moment of Anthony Hamilton holding Isack and telling him that everything is going to be okay and to keep his head up. And not only does he give him some kind words, he holds him, he lets the kid cry, and he walks with Isack for a long period of time, continuing to comfort him, continuing to tell him that everything's going to be okay. And if you don't follow a lot of the pre-Formula One stuff, you may not realize how big of a Lewis Hamilton fan that Isack Hadjar is. And not only has he talked about it in interviews, and there was like a little bit of ribbing from the other rookies when they did the all-rookie interview, but we also saw when Isack got his first chance to drive in a free practice, he said over the radio that he wanted to wave at Lewis. He's talked about being a massive Lewis Hamilton fan. He's talked about how he's recognized that Lewis is the person to beat, and that's what he wants to model his career after. And we've seen pictures of him from Isaac's childhood, of him trying to meet Lewis Hamilton, of him getting Lewis Hamilton's autograph, of him taking a selfie with Lewis. And that selfie actually got recreated at the driver's parade. And to be honest, like that kind of behavior, that fanboy behavior, was really endearing to me, and I was really starting to enjoy Isaac's personality. And I think there's something that ups it even more when he has this devastating moment, and not only does Anthony Hamilton, who's not on his team, come out and just show him a moment of kindness, but this is also the father of his childhood hero. And the reason I'm maybe harping on this is that not only do I think it was just a very wholesome moment and a beautiful moment, but I also think sports can teach us a lot about the way we should live our own lives. This is a high level of competition, and to some degree, Lewis Hamilton's dad should 100% back Ferrari and have no interest in what happens to the V-Carb team. But also, in a moment of humanity and a moment of being a father, Anthony Hamilton saw this happen, and his first instinct was to leave the garage of his own son and go out to intercept this child who needed a dad. And that's really like what that interaction was. That was a father-like reaction. And maybe it was so moving to me because I'm so close with my dad, and I watch my dad try to be, fatherly when someone needs the help. But I think one of the things that's important about sports is recognizing where competition and humanity do need to cross over. There's a moment where there is space for empathy. Even when you're racing at this top level where things are dangerous, things are fast, things are on the line, there is still a moment to see someone in pain and to have empathy for him and to try to help and to try to offer comfort. And I think these moments from sports, I constantly talk about this extreme level of competition, what we do under pressure, what we can learn from sports when it comes to leadership and teamwork. But there's also moments like this where we can learn about empathy, when we can learn about being a good person, and where we can learn about the fact that just because someone is your competitor doesn't mean they're not also kind of a fellow human being. And so that's why I think these moments move me so much, because I think sports, especially sports like Formula One, really operate at this level of the extreme edges of what the human body and the human spirit is capable of. And sometimes that is on the opposite side too. Sometimes that's not competition. Sometimes that's not mental toughness. Sometimes it's kindness. And the other thing that I do want to point out, because I've seen a lot of conversation about this, is that some people across the board, fans and members of teams alike, have said that the tears were embarrassing and that men, for some reason, shouldn't cry. And I just think that is such an antiquated, harmful idea. I do not understand why we still think that men should not show emotion, or even really where we decided which emotions were emotion that are bad and which emotions were just sort of not emotional. Like, anger is emotion. When we see drivers like Max Verstappen have extreme outbursts on the radio, or we see drivers like Liam Lawson throwing the bird, or drivers like Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg getting so angry with each other on track that they crash their own cars out and ruin both of their races. All of those things are emotion. All of those things are high emotional outbursts. But for some reason, when we are talking about men or we're talking about male athletes, we seem to think that those emotions that are more outwardly harmful towards someone else, those are okay for some reason. Those are non-emotional emotions. No one's ever saying that Max is too emotional. They're saying that he is a little too angry or a little too animated or a little too blunt. No one was saying that Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton were too emotional to be on track together, but they were talking about the fact that they were the highest level of competitors and that someone needed to figure out how to keep them in line. These things, I think, really do keep men from feeling comfortable enough to express emotions that are important, because when we see something that is perhaps not as abrasive of an emotion, like crying when your life's goal that you've finally accomplished slips away in a second, for some reason that's embarrassing. For some reason that means you're not good enough to do this. For some reason we ascribe this idea of not man enough to these emotions. And I think it's harmful. I think it's antiquated, and I think it keeps people from continuing to heal and move on. I think what Isack needed in that moment and what he'll need for the rest of the week so that he can lock in and go to China and drive well is empathy, is humanity, is being told that it's fine and you will move forward. And also is being shown that he's not the only one who crashed out. I think when you're looking at it and you look at a rookie who's had race experience like Ollie Behrman, who really didn't practice at all this weekend because he couldn't keep the car on track. I think those are things that Isack needs to hear. I think they're things that he needs to look at. I think that helps you regulate those emotions and get back behind the wheel of your car and not be so emotional that you can't focus. I think that helps you lock in, it helps you heal, and it helps you move forward. I don't think that a conversation calling him soft, calling him embarrassing, or saying that crying shouldn't happen in sports is helpful in any way, shape, or form. So I'm gonna get off my soapbox, but the first lap, I guess, really upset me, you know? The reaction to a 20-year-old objectively boy crying after something horrible happened is kind of outrageous to me. It just feels like we should be past this. It's 2025. It's completely acceptable and fine to react to something that is stressful and sad and upsetting and cry about it. Get it off your chest and move forward and keep yourself focused for the next race. And I guess if you're listening to this and you're wondering why I'm this upset, I just want you to know that crying is an acceptable emotion. It's an acceptable response. We also see people do it when they win. We've seen some of the greatest athletes photographed crying when they're holding a championship trophy. It's also okay to cry when things go wrong. And it's okay to dust yourself up and move forward after that. So now that I have essentially said it's okay for men to cry, or anybody, everybody, you can cry. It's acceptable. That, I think I've made the point. Let's move into the race itself. And I think we have to point out that Lando Norris has gotten his starts under control. Because I will be honest, after qualifying yesterday, I was pretty nervous for the start of this race. It was set up in exactly the type of way that we would be nervous about for Lando last year. We have objectively two of his biggest threats lined up right behind him. His teammate Oscar in P2 and Max Verstappen in P3. So when the lights went out, I will be honest, it was a nail biter for me. I was like, please don't let anybody crash. And sort of, I guess that happened. We have this really clean takeoff from Lando. He not only blocks Oscar, but he outmaneuvers Max. And then quite quickly, Max actually outmaneuvers Oscar. And while none of our starting three crashed, which is what I had been focusing my energy on, unfortunately, we do go under safety car conditions almost immediately as Jack Doohan becomes the second rookie to fall victim to the rain. And then almost immediately under that safety car, we have Carlos Sainz put it in the wall himself. And this is, I guess, my point with the Isack situation. He's getting a lot of flack for going out on the formation lap, but Carlos Sainz, a driver who was much more experienced than him, who's also adjusting to a new car, goes out on a safety car lap. These conditions were pretty brutal, and quite obviously drivers of all skill levels were having the same problem. One thing I do want to point out about Carlos's crash is that we don't know exactly what caused it. We don't know that it was necessarily driver error. Williams and Carlos have both said that there was something in the data that they have resolved and that they feel more comfortable about the fact that he did crash, that they feel like they know what the problem was. We also heard Carlos say that he had gotten a sudden burst of torque, and that happened right before he crashed. So I don't want this to sound like I am saying Alex is so much better than him and this was such a big driver error and a rookie mistake. To be clear, it does seem like there was an element of a mechanical issue, though it was not specified as far as I know what exactly it was. I think Carlos is going to be just fine in the Williams, but I also think Alex finishing and having Carlos work as a good teammate is a good confidence boost for him and a good comfort situation for him moving forward. We go all the way to lap 8 under safety car conditions, and then it's time for another fresh start, which again, Lando handles well. I have to be honest with you, Lando's restarts this race were probably the most exciting thing to me because I think that is a big part of the pressure he was under last year. I think these starts for him have been a real struggle. He'll have pole position and then he just completely botches it. And especially when he's under the pressure of Oscar or Max, people who consistently stress him out. I don't know what happened over the break, but I do feel like Lando is either like trying box breathing, he's got a sports psychologist, I don't know. We do know that he sort of visualizes before races. That was shown in Drive to Survive from last season, but I think there has been a visible mental shift from Lando this year. Listening to him in press conferences, watching him take on the race, and even listening to him on the radio this race, I have to be honest with you, I think Lando worked on the mental part of this over the break. And last year, I really didn't think it was a skill issue. I thought it was a mental block. So seeing him come out and deal with the things that are the most stressful for him, and not only deal with them, but deal with them multiple times in the same race, in wet conditions, and then listening to him talk on the radio with extreme calm and understanding of what he was looking for, working with his engineer, working with the team to try to figure out the right strategy with their tires, and then listening to him talk after the race, I think Lando has worked on one of the biggest issues he had last year. And quite frankly, I think that's going to make racing a lot more exciting this year. Then we actually have a stretch of laps that is going pretty well until another rookie, Fernando Alonso, crashes into the barrier. If you're not very online about the Formula One fandom, or you're feeling like Laura Winter in the rookies interview right now, there are jokes that Fernando Alonso is a rookie. Kimi Antonelli made a joke about this in the Formula One rookies interview. It's not that important, but Fernando Alonso did crash into the wall. And again, I think this is a point that's kind of important when we're talking about evaluating rookie performance this week. This race was so wet that even the oldest driver on the grid could not keep his car on track. In terms of race stories outside of all of the crashing and the safety cars, as we know, Fernando Alonso was not the final retirement of that race. We also saw Gabriel Bortoleto and Liam Lawson crash out and not continue the race. That gave us a total of 6 retirements due to crashing. And of the cars that were able to remain on track, the race story here, I think, is a couple of different things. One, we have McLaren. And there are 2 parts to that. One, we talked about Lando Norris being a little bit better at his starts, which again, he had to restart the race multiple times this race and managed to continue to keep the lead. But we also have this point where we have to talk about McLaren team orders. At a certain point, Oscar Piastri was coming in close on Lando Norris. And as Oscar was chasing Lando down, the team told him to hold position until they were able to change the tires. And I know we're not at the questions point yet, but I did get a couple of these, so I want to address it as we're talking about this, because I've also seen a lot of conversation saying that this really screwed Oscar over, and also some confusion about the fact that later in the race, Oscar was told he was free to race. From what we could hear on the radio, the call to not pass Lando was not actually team orders to let Lando win. It was a strategy call regarding tire strategy. At that point, both McLarens were comfortably in the lead and had a pretty good window to be able to pit and put themselves on tires that worked for the rain. The weather during this race was consistently changing, and so we consistently saw these drivers talking about whether or not they needed to change their tires, what the forecast actually looked like, how it was shifting, when the rain was coming, how long it would last, and ultimately the strategy that these teams chose was really what determined who won the race. And so for McLaren to ask Oscar to hold position until they have a chance to change the tires, that is actually just good team strategy, trying to make sure that both drivers are protected and looking further down the race than just a singular driver and their ability to pass. Now, did that decision change Oscar's mentality, throw him off enough that he made mistakes and ultimately cost him a race win? I would say not only do we not know, but if that is the case, it would be an interesting mentality to believe that this driver, who we think could win a race, has won races before and has been in this conversation about being better than Lando as a whole, would have one strategy call that would throw him off so deeply that he couldn't maintain second position. Maybe he wouldn't have won the race ultimately, sure, but Oscar ultimately finished in 9th, and that was actually due to mistakes on track. So I don't know that it's fair to say that this one strategy call cost Oscar a race win or even a higher position. I think this race had a number of mistakes across a number of drivers. It was really tough conditions, and as we heard everyone talk about, the way that the track was drying, there was only one part of the track that was dry, and that was the racing line. So even when you got close enough to pass, you had to move yourself into the wet portion of the track and try to execute a safe pass that way. It's much more difficult than being able to just pass on a dry track. Their tires were all in very different situations, and there's nothing to say that there wouldn't have been other problems if it weren't for this one strategy call. And to be honest, I was actually pretty happy to hear McLaren be clear on the radio about what they wanted, especially when it came to 2 drivers battling it out. There was a very clear call: do not battle until this point of the race, and then when that point came, you were then free to race. And then I think the main thing that really determined how this race went was when teams decided to pit and go on to inters for the last stretch of the race. We know that we heard Lando on the radio for a long period of time asking to go on inters. We heard similar conversations across the board with various drivers and their race engineers, and the teams who got their pit strategy right had a better race than the teams who didn't. Rain is unpredictable, but it is a little frustrating when you hear drivers arguing and then they turn out to be right. And then the last section on Lando and Max was that we saw Lando actually pit for those tires 3 laps before Max. Max tried to stay out on slicks and was ultimately unable to do so, giving him an advantage to some degree, because that's why we saw them get so close by the end of the race. Lando had really shredded his inters, having been out on the dry portion of the track on tires that are not made for that for a longer portion of the race than Max was on his. Max was able to catch up, which is actually an interesting point for the rest of this season, because as this gap seems pretty big, if you listen to Lando talk about this after the race race in the post-race press conference, he didn't feel that they were necessarily so far ahead that Max couldn't have caught him. While this did really come down to tire strategy, there is the fact that the Red Bull does not seem as behind pace as we thought it was. And Max is still Max. And the other big race story outside of the top was, of course, the Ferrari situation. If you have been watching Formula One for a while, or you've been a Ferrari fan before, you know that trouble with the strategy team is not necessarily a new feeling. But it was particularly hard to watch this race. Both Lewis and Charles multiple times told the race engineers to leave them to it, to stop repeating themselves, to stop giving so much information, and to let them race. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves, this is mostly just growing pains, especially on Lewis's side. Lewis has had the same race engineer for an extremely large portion of his career. They have a shorthand, they know exactly how to talk to each other, they know exactly what needs to be said in order to get the message across. And this is a brand new team and a brand new engineer for Lewis. And also a brand new driver for this engineer. So quite frankly, I actually thought their tone was not at all snappy. Both of them seemed to be trying to figure out how to communicate what they needed from the other person, and they just don't have that shorthand yet. Though there was something particularly painful about listening to someone almost give a tutorial on a steering wheel to a 7-time world champion. But objectively, again, we're going to see those growing pains, especially given that this is the first race of the season. But obviously, the radio interaction of the day goes to Leclerc and his race engineer when they're talking about water. There was something so snappy, outrageous, and hilarious about this interaction. You have Charles kind of hectically asking, is there a leakage? The race engineer saying, a leakage of what? Charles saying that his seat is full of water, and the race engineer saying it must be the water. And then an absolute zinger from the Prince of Monaco. Yes, let's add that to the words of wisdom. I think what did happen here is it sounds like the water that Charles is able to drink while he's driving must have been punctured or leaked or something, and so then he was getting all of that in his seat. But again, this was just sort of indicative of the state that Ferrari was in this week. Rough communication between engineer and driver. That was the case for both drivers. And then ultimately pretty bad tire strategy that cost them the race. There was a 30-second period where Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were running 1-2. And I have to be honest, there would have been an incredible story in this world of Ferrari brings on Lewis Hamilton and they come into their first race and they get a 1-2 after taking a risky tire strategy. But that risky tire strategy was just that. It was risky. And while they would have had a pretty great opportunity had they pitted when I believe both Lewis and Charles had asked for their inters, it's possible we would have seen them much further up the lineup because that pit stop strategy really cost them a number of positions. When they came back out, they were running right at the back of the pack. And that was the first moment I think we heard true frustration out loud from Lewis. And I have to be honest, I hope the two of them, Charles and Lewis, went and had drinks and just calmed down together and commiserated and they could move forward. And hopefully we can get some team bonding exercises, maybe the two of them and all of their race engineers and their team, they can all go paintball. I think paintball is a verb. I'm making it a verb. I do think that as painful as it was to watch the Ferrari situation, I don't think that it will last this way for a long period of time. I think everybody has made a lot of changes at that team, not just in the driver lineup and that situation, but also in the kind of actual lineup of the team itself. Fred has been making changes, bringing over new talent, and there are adjustments that have to be made to get everybody to feel comfortable. Both drivers did finish in the points, just far below the points that they're used to finishing at. And unfortunately, a similar tire strategy cost Yuki his high position, and conversely, a really good tire strategy from Alex Albon put him in 5th. He did originally show that he was 4th because Kimi Antonelli had been given a penalty, but that penalty was later overturned by the FIA, giving Kimi 4th and putting Alex back down in 5th. But 5th is an incredible finish for Alex in the Williams, the first race of the season being that high up in the grid. And additionally, finishing that high when Carlos did not even finish the race. I think this is a really big boost, hopefully, to his kind of confidence for the rest of the season. But also, we found out later that this is a really great sign of the actual teamwork we're going to see between Carlos and Alex moving forward this season. Carlos, as we know, was out of that race early on with the first safety car. But instead of sulking or sitting somewhere and being upset, he actually joined Alex's pit wall. And when they were getting into the conversation about when they should switch for inters, Carlos was the one who helped Alex make the call to actually change to inters. And when they collectively made that decision, it was the right move. And it allowed Alex to finish so high up and have such a great race. I think Williams, overall, the performance of the car and also the performance of the drivers and the team and the way that they're gelling really personally surprised me. I think if we go back to old episodes from last season, we'll probably hear that I thought it was not going to work out. I do think that Carlos seems to really be invested in the forward progress of this team. And to be able to help your teammate in a situation like this is actually a very positive energy, and I think it's going to be good for the team overall. And while James Vowles was maybe just a little too open and honest about how he was courting Carlos Sainz last season, it does seem like this was probably the right move for the team overall. So it's early on. I'm not going to say this is a perfect scenario and the two of them are going to have this incredible season. Next week, we could see the complete opposite. But it was nice to see Carlos take a disappointing day and turn it into something that he wanted to help with. And then one of the last really big stories for me with this race is Kimi Antonelli Antonelli. Like I said at the top of this, I think he came in with probably the highest amount of expectation for any of these rookie drivers. You're filling a seat that was previously filled by Lewis Hamilton, though I think he's been objective and tried to tell people that he is not replacing Lewis Hamilton. He's just, a new driver that came after Lewis Hamilton. You have conversations of people saying if he wins within the first 4 races, he will beat Max Verstappen for the youngest race winner ever. And the conversations surrounding him moving into this team have been a tough one. It was a lot of pressure to put on someone that was this young. And the question really was, is he going to live up to that? Or is he going to kind of crash out and crumble under the pressure? I don't think we can make this determination just based off of one race, but I do think this was an incredibly difficult race. Kimi Antonelli raced like he knew what he was doing, made pretty strong and aggressive moves throughout the field, and went from being knocked out in Q1 to finishing P4. And it should be noted that he finished right behind George Russell, his teammate who has been with the team significantly longer, has significantly more experience in Formula One, and overall really should be outperforming Kimi at a high level. And I think watching it, we actually saw that if Kimi had had some more laps, and honestly, I do wonder if there hadn't been as many safety cars, it's possible that he would have beaten George on their debut. Again, conjecture, speculation, just my theory here, but I do think that when you look at how much of this race was under a safety car, and you look at how much space Kimi Antonelli made up for himself, it's really possible that he could have really been a threat to George's podium this race. But again, if safety cars did happen, they do happen, and they are a part of racing. So it's hard to say if we had never had any safety cars, yeah, of course, if nobody had had a safety car, then a lot of things would be different. If we never had safety cars, Lando may never have won a race. But that's just not what happened. We do have safety cars. Kimi didn't pass George, but it is interesting to think about because personally, I was a little stressed about this whole situation. I felt like it was a lot of pressure to put on someone so young and genuinely so untested. Kimi moved very quickly through the ranks, had an extreme amount of pressure put on him, and also a lot of the narrative behind them losing Lewis came from this fact that Toto Wolff really wanted Kimi in the team. And so that expectation also is not just that Kimi has to be good, it's that he has to be good enough to justify losing Lewis Hamilton. And again, it's only one race, but Kimi was one of 2 rookies who made it to the end of the race. And between the points that he scored with George and the fact that Oscar was so low on the rankings, he helped Mercedes tie with McLaren for first position in the constructors. Both teams have 27 points right now. So while we can't necessarily chalk everything up after one race, I will say that I think Kimi has shown he has a lot of potential here, and he may be able to live up to the hype. Lastly, we obviously have the Liam Lawson situation. I think this was just a really tough week for Lawson. I think it's going to be hard because he's going to be consistently following the question of should Yuki have been in that seat? And additionally, I think the other question is if Yuki had been in a Red Bull and not a V-Carb, had a Red Bull strategist running the same strategy that they ran for Max or a similar one, where would Yuki have finished in that Red Bull? Again, a question that I think is going to follow us all season. So that wraps up the kind of big takeaways for me for the race. And now I think we're going to get into your questions, hot takes, and predictions for the rest of the year. Okay, first one, which I actually think is a relevant thing to talk about because of how many crashes we had today, was do they do concussion checks after the crashes? This is kind of a sticky subject and actually became super relevant last year. Technically, the official policy is if a driver is suspected of having a concussion, they do have to undergo concussion protocol, meaning that they are evaluated, and if they are diagnosed with a concussion, there is a certain amount of time they have to spend out of the car, and there are tests that they have to pass before they can get back in the car. This is pretty standard with sports that have a possibility of head trauma. However, we did find out last year that this is not a perfect situation. In an interview, Max Verstappen revealed that since 2021, when he had a pretty nasty crash with Lewis Hamilton, he has had severe vision issues. This is obviously pretty dangerous. A driver hurtling around a track at a high speed, not being able to necessarily see everything he should. And it did spawn a conversation about whether or not the current concussion protocol is enough. So basically, short answer to your question, yes, they do check for concussions. Long answer, just like the NFL and other sports, it does seem like that concussion protocol could probably be improved. And to be honest, I think that is a situation with professional sports in general. There's this level of expectation that like an athlete is always going to perform kind of the same way that you're expected to go to work even if you're sick. I know that is more of an American thing, but it is still a situation. But especially in sports, and especially sports like Formula One, where if you miss a race, it does affect your point count overall. I actually think that's an interesting point to kind of think about. If you look at other team sports like basketball, for example, if a player is physically unable to compete, they are able to sub another player in. Obviously, in Formula One, the same thing is true. We have reserve drivers for this very reason. However, in a basketball game, if a team wins a championship and a player was out for 3 games, they still get that championship ring. It's still considered a win for their season overall. Same thing with sports like American football, soccer, or football, but with racing, we have 2 championships. So it's kind of similar to the way a sport like tennis or golf would work. Those are individual championships, and if an athlete wasn't able to compete due to a physical issue, they would simply just not win the championship. They would not win a match, they would not be able to compete. But there's no team element there. Formula One is a unique combination of both. So if a driver has a concussion and can't race for 2 races, that obviously affects their ability to win a championship individually. However, as a driver on a constructor's team, the points that their replacement, their reserve driver would actually score would go towards that constructor's score, and the driver who had a concussion and missed those races would still be considered a constructor's champion if they won. So there's an argument to be made that the individual championship aspect of this does keep drivers from being able to take time off in a real way. From a non-medical standpoint, we had the same conversation about the fact that Max Verstappen has a kid on the way, and if that kid was to come during the middle of a race weekend or before a race weekend, he would have to weigh taking a race off to be there for the birth of his child versus being able to score those points. And as Max said, Formula One drivers don't really get time off. So kind of a long answer to your question because it's kind of a complicated issue, but yes, they do check and they do have medical professionals available at the track. Okay, next one, has Fernando lost his mojo? Guys, this is such a tense topic. But I kind of think yes, and only because I'm not going to judge just off of this race. I was feeling this way last year, and I feel like he was feeling this way by the end of the season too, as we started to hear him say that 2026 will definitely be his retirement year. We know he has a contract with Aston Martin that goes through the end of next season in 2026, and when that contract was announced, they did call it a lifetime contract, so I assume that means he has some sort of a plan for an advisory role or something like that after he leaves the actual driver's seat. I think it's possible that if this season does not go well, we may start to see that come earlier rather than later, especially given that Yuki Tsunoda is going to be a puzzle piece in the grid next year. There are options for Yuki to potentially stay with the Red Bull family, but as Honda moves over to Aston Martin, there is also a possibility and a desire for him to move along with them. And if Fernando personally feels that he's past his prime and past the ability to drive anymore, we may see him retire early, and I think if we did see him retire early, we would see Yuki Tsunoda fill that seat. However, again, it is only race 1 of the season. It was a tough race, it was wet, and anything is possible. Next week, we could see a totally different Fernando. Okay, next question. Do engineers/drivers practice comms in the sim? Ferrari's communication was so bad. This one is actually an interesting question, and I wanted to bring it up because Lando actually talked a little bit about this. In the press conference. Post-race, he was asked what the rest of the team did to increase their possibility of being better at their jobs. And Lando was pretty clear and firm that he was not going to share that information. He said that they are professionals just like he is, and he wouldn't share that information with the media about the things that they do to make themselves better. So in terms of what actually happens between an engineer and a driver in terms of what they do to prepare, I'm sure it varies from team to team and relationship to relationship, but you are right, there was a pretty rough kind of energy in between both drivers and their race engineers. We know last year Charles Leclerc also swapped his race engineer and there was some trouble there, though we did hear a conversation about that mostly just being an internal shift. That original race engineer had gone on to have a different position at Ferrari and then he was given a new one. All of that being said, it actually kind of felt like the problem was a desire to over-communicate. Both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton continued to say, that's enough, I don't need that information, please leave me to it. And a lot of the information that they were being given did seem almost remedial. Press this button, this mode is available. Those things are also kind of clear to a driver on their steering wheel. After the fact, Lewis Hamilton did say that he felt that his engineer did a good job for their first time around, and just that it's a matter of hammering out communication style. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they are brand new to each other. So Lewis is telling him that he wants less information, and hopefully next time around that will be the case. And hopefully Charles Leclerc and his engineer can find a little bit of a energy where facts are discussed clearly. Okay, the next ones are all about Piastri, so I'm gonna kind of bring a couple of them together. First, did McLaren set up Piastri to fail by not letting him pass Norris when he had the momentum? Second, do you think Max would have still gotten P2 if Oscar never went off track? And third, Piastri has a championship winning car. Does he have what it takes to grab it? So let's go through this. I've already said that I don't think that one strategy call moment was enough to obliterate Oscar's entire race. If Oscar had gotten to a situation where he had actually finished P2 in the race, I think it would be a much easier conversation to have to say that he could have possibly won the race had he not been stopped there. But because we saw him make a pretty large mistake and actually fall all the way out of the points and have to fight his way back up into them and end up with a P9 in the end, I don't feel like we can say with this one specific moment everything fell apart. I think that it's possible that Oscar did get frustrated. I also think that this is his home race and there is a conversation about which of these two drivers is being prioritized. Oscar also just upped his contract, and I do wonder what his expectation was with that. If he's going to be here long term, does he believe that he is going to be prioritized over Lando? And did he get frustrated by that call and feel that that was not what was happening? We already know that he had a very sassy response, to be honest, in being asked not to kind of pass Lando. That response was, okay, I'm faster, but okay. And I think that actually, for me, made me a little frustrated with him because I think he is a really smart driver. And when your team is talking to you about tire strategy and about weather that's coming that you can't see, and your response to being told to hold position for a period of time until they can can make the strategy call that they need to make, being kind of childlike in, okay, but I'm faster. Again, I'm not going to say that Lando was not childlike last year and we may see the same energy again, but I think a lot of people missed the end of that radio message. Specifically, he was told to hold position until they could change the tires, and later he was given the ability to race. Had he focused on that, had he not gone completely off the track, I think the conversation could potentially be valid if he had finished P2. But he also allowed Max to pass him, and he went off the track to the point that we had a yellow flag, which allowed that gap to close a little bit between Lando and Max, and was this potential safety car, to the point of can he actually win the championship? What I will say is we'll have to see how he performs next week. My thing about this is that Oscar getting back on the track and continuing to race does show a mental stability that he wants to win, and does show that he's not willing to give up. Getting out of the grass in that way, reversing, getting back on track safely is a hard thing to do, and then additionally to be able to actually fight your way back up to 9th shows that you still have hunger. So my feelings on Oscar and your questions about them are a little complicated, but I think there is a possibility. This one's pretty easy. Should Ferrari have stayed out? No. I think this one is an interesting point though, because my big issue is that it would have been valuable to maybe split the strategy. Red Bull actually stayed out longer, but they didn't have the ability to choose between two different strategies with two different drivers. Ferrari was one of the few teams that actually had both drivers still in the mix, and they could have easily run a split strategy, put one of their drivers on inters, leave the other driver out, and see how things went. Also, both of the drivers were actively asking to go in to change their tires and stating that it was not going well. Across the board, this just seems like the wrong call to me. But again, easy for me to say that. I watched the race from the comfort of my own home and they lost. What happened with Sainz was his crash because of a wet car issue. We don't know exactly what happened, but we did see the team come out and say that they have analyzed data and figured it out. And we also saw that when he crashed, he said he had a sudden burst of torque. So it's most likely an issue with the car and not completely like a skill issue. He didn't just forget how to drive in the rain. And I'd say we don't have enough information to completely know, but I would say don't like write him off. Next one is Williams back, all caps. I actually think that this is going to be a really good season for Williams. I was not actually convinced of that at the end of last year. If you go back to my predictions, I really didn't feel this way. But I think Carlos and Alex are going to have a good kind of situation here. I think Carlos feels like he's very valued. I think Carlos also brings a lot of strategy and knowledge, and we know that he is comfortable calling his own race strategy from his time at Ferrari, which also leans into the fact that he was able to help Alex call his strategy this weekend. Alex as well really performed at over 8 that I think was great. And sometimes I think it's important for drivers in these pairings to have two very strong drivers because they push each other. Previously, Alex felt pretty comfortable. His teammate was Logan Sargent, and we unfortunately know that this was not a driver who was performing at a high level, which almost always meant that Alex would go on track and always outperform his teammate. This is not a given anymore. And I think that is going to push Alex to be a stronger driver, because when the only person that you're really competing against directly is yourself, a lot of times it puts a ceiling on your performance. And so I think that having someone who is a stronger driver than you objectively, has had more experience, has been at a higher level than you, being your direct teammate, your direct competition, the only person who has the same car as you, I think that forces you to be a better driver. And I think we may have seen a level of that shown in Australia. And lastly, we had a bunch of questions about drivers unlapping themselves during a safety car. This is a complicated situation. One of the questions specifically asked why Crofty was freaking out. I actually don't watch Sky Sports. I watch F1 TV, so that was not like the same energy I was receiving. However, the rule is basically that during a safety car, when it's ending, lapped drivers are able to unlap themselves and join the main lap. This means that they can overtake the safety car and return to the back of the line. The reason this exists is that it's supposed to hopefully stop the start from being very chaotic. It keeps us from having a two-tiered grid at the start, which also would mean that some drivers are going to be getting blue flag conditions, which is the flag that we put out when we say that you are lapped. You have to let the driver who is ahead of you actually pass you coming up. If we start with lapped cars from a safety car, it's possible that those blue flag conditions could cause crashes and more issues, because as drivers are trying to speed up, they're also being told to slow down. That being said, the reason that it is a controversial conversation is that in 2021, during the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, cars were able to unlap themselves, which was the reason that Lewis Hamilton lost that race and subsequently the championship. The rule was then changed so that the drivers who were unlapping themselves only had one lap from that warning to unlap themselves. At that point, the safety car is then pulled back in, and drivers who haven't finished unlapping are just kind of where they are. So those are a lot of the questions. Let's drop into hot takes. There were a lot of these, which did not surprise me because it was a hot takeable race. It was freezing cold and sizzling hot at the same time. I actually agree with this. There were portions of the race where my heart rate on my Apple Watch had spiked, but there were also portions when we were just sitting under a safety car that I was so bored. So it was this weird whiplash where you're like, are we going to get any interesting racing, or are we going to just watch the safety car? And then you're like, oh my God, that they're actually, maybe they're going to hit each other. I do not blame McLaren for telling Oscar to not race Lando. It was for the safety of the team. I feel like I've made it clear that I agreed with that. Lance did a great job, and it wasn't mentioned in the broadcast. This is actually true of both Lance and George. And I feel like it happens more often with George Russell, where he gets himself into a position where like he should be the focus of the race, but he ends up in some sort of like no man's land where it's not actually relevant to the excitement of the race. So they don't talk about it during the broadcast. And then by the time we get to the end, he wasn't really involved in much. So it's like not relevant. And I feel like that might be a little bit of a bummer. Honestly, I'm sure he's fine. He just hit the podium. He's cool. But there was just so much of this race where he just was like not a threat. He was sort of idling too far away from second to make a real position there. And nobody was close enough behind him in fourth for it to be a real battle. And same for Lance. I think it was just because there wasn't a lot of actual issues for him. There wasn't a lot of tension. There wasn't a lot of excitement. Okay, next one, Papaya Rules. McLaren free to race at the start, holding positions with a 0.3 second gap, free to race at 2.3 seconds. I think we've gone over this one. I do think that like it's hard to say that this is going to be a problem. The one thing that I think we have to address is the fact that they did give clear orders both times. Whether your feelings are that that resulted in Oscar not winning the race, it's fair. If you feel that that's the reason that Oscar lost the race, that's okay. You can feel that way. But I think one of the biggest things that McLaren were criticized for last year by myself and a ton of other people and the fandom in general was the lack of clear orders and driver prioritization. I do think that happened this race. Next hot take, both Williams would have beaten Ferrari if Carlos didn't crash. I don't know. I don't know that we would have beaten both Ferraris, but it is honestly possible. They both really had a struggle. I do wonder what the strategy would have looked like. Would they have considered splitting something? I don't know, maybe. Honestly, it does seem like Williams has a better handle on their new driver lineup and their new relationships. Kimi should have gotten driver of the day. I love Lando, but Kimi's drive was exceptional. I actually agree with this one. Kimi was my vote for driver of the day. I think he did a really good job, and I think it was really impressive. I also think Lando did a great job too. It's a hard race. It's exciting. I think a lot of people are going to vote for their favorite, especially when their favorite wins the race. And to be fair, Lando did go from pole position and hold first for the entire race, other than obviously when he pitted. Crashes should have been red flagged. There were a couple of people who had this hot take, but I actually don't agree with it. I think if you listen to the drivers talk afterwards, especially the three that won, everything was fine for them. Max even said if you couldn't drive around them under a safety car, you shouldn't be in Formula One. And I honestly don't think that this was a dangerous situation. There have been other dangerous situations where we haven't seen a red flag called. George's race last year where he was calling for a red flag and sounded terrified comes to mind. But this one, I really don't think was a situation that needed to be red flagged. I think it's hard because part of Formula One is being able to drive in all these different conditions. And driving in the rain is a condition that you're supposed to be able to do as a driver and as a team. All of those changing conditions are things that make the sport interesting, I think, because otherwise you would have the exact same race every single time. This season will be boring yet worth watching as Williams and Kimi spice it up. I don't know that I agree that this season's going to be boring. I think you have at the front some pretty strong contenders. And I also think you're going to have a situation similar to last year where drivers who did not start out very strong slowly but surely figure their stuff out. I think the cars are going to continue to develop. And I think this race we had midfield teams that were competitive at the front of the pack. And again, I also think determining this based off of one outlier race that had very odd conditions isn't really fair. But it is a hot take, and that is the portion of this episode that we're at. So, it's fine. Hot enough. George continues to just be lucky. Here's the thing I'm going to say. I think what George has on his side, where his real strength lies, is his qualifying pace. George qualified P4 significantly ahead of his teammate, who, yes, is a rookie, but ultimately had a really great drive. And we know that last season, in a head-to-head situation, he was out-qualifying Lewis. George's problem has typically, and was last year, his ability to hold that position throughout the race. This is the same reason why we saw frequently last year where George would qualify him very far ahead of Lewis, but by the end of the race, Lewis was right up against him. And I will say we did see the same thing with Kimi Antonelli this week. George qualified far ahead of Kimi Antonelli, and in a pretty rough conditioned race, Kimi made it all the way up to right behind him. So I don't know that we can say George is simply lucky. I think what we can say is that qualifying is a big portion of racing, and qualifying becomes much more important in races like this where conditions are very intense, because you have a much harder time passing, there are much more intense conditions where people are worried about crashing, and it's less likely that you're going to be able to move up the field or that people are going to be able to pass you. What George did with this drive, which again, I guess was part of what I was saying when we were talking about this earlier, saying that nobody really was commentating on his race. Same for Lance. George qualified fourth, made his way up to third, and held that position for the rest of the race. What I will say is that after the race, we also saw Lando kind of criticize his mentality, saying that George made comments saying that they need to focus on 2026 and they can't really catch up this year. And I do think that that may hold him back. If Mercedes is only focused on next year and sort of willing to throw this year away, then George and Kimi both won't get to a high level. And I hope that's not the case, because just in the name of good competition, it would be best to see them both focused on the best possible result. And I did kind of mix a lot lot of people's hot takes for this because a lot of people had similar ones. So if you didn't hear yours worded exactly the way that you sent it, I did read it and it probably was kind of mixed in. And lastly, we have a race again on Sunday. So let's get into your predictions for that race and for the 2025 season. There are a number of predictions of McLaren dominance. And to be honest, yeah, I think we're going to see that at least for the first portion of the season. There is a possibility that we will see an issue with the fact that they have a mini DRS that has been challenged, which basically means there's a portion of the rear wing that is allowing them to have an advantage. This is something that was challenged last year and does appear to be challenged again, and does appear that it will be restricted moving forward. So that being said, there could be a restriction there that does change the game a little bit. However, I still don't think that it is a massive change, and I really think we're going to see a large portion of this season be dominated by McLaren, and that the interesting part will be between the two drivers and how McLaren handles it moving forward. A lot of people are saying that Hadjar will be the best rookie, that he'll outscore the rest of them. I think Isack may be second. I do think Kimi Antonelli is going to be higher up on the rankings, and part of that is just the fact that he's much further up the field in a better car. However, I think if you take Kimi out, which is an outlier, Isack is going to outscore the rest of the rookies. A couple of midfield predictions. We've got a Carlos podium for Williams as well as a Hulk podium. I do think the midfield teams are going to be an interesting situation this year. I think we're going to see them perform a lot stronger and be a little bit more of a problem than we're used to seeing them be. We've got a Williams P5 in the constructor. That was the most specific, other than people saying that this person's going to win or this team is going to win. And to be honest, I don't know if it's going to be P5, but I do think we'll see them up further than we're expecting. This person says an Oscar, Kimi, and Lewis podium. I'm not sure if that's for any time this year or next week, but I do think it's possible and I kind of would love to see it. There's something very funny about Lewis being up there with two of the youngest drivers on the grid. I guess Oscar's not necessarily as young as he used to be now that we have such an influx of younger people, but I kind of would like to see the energy that comes from that. And here's another one. Lawson won't finish this season, at least in a Red Bull, maybe for VCarb. This one is the last one that I'm going to go through because I do think it's an interesting one and it's something that I have been thinking about. One thing I think Red Bull is actually pretty well known for, and whether you agree with the strategy or not, it is a good business strategy to some degree. They're very good at putting pressure on their drivers by letting them know they can be replaced with someone else. Yuki Tsunoda did not get this promotion and Liam Lawson did. However, you can tell by Yuki's tone and his energy that he is still fighting to be there. Part of that is the fact that he does not have a seat for next year, but part of that is the fact that he is aware, just like everyone else is, that a Red Bull seat doesn't mean you get to stay there forever. The second you have not been performing at the level that we need you to be, we're going to swap you out. Yuki has seen that happen to his teammates multiple times, and so he knows that it's possible for Liam as well. And Liam knows that too. So if Liam continues to have poor performance, which again, as we said, I don't know that it's fair to just base that off of just this race, there is a possibility that we see a driver swap. The question would be, who is that driver swap with? Who is showing enough promise? Is it Yuki? Is it Isack? Is it someone else? However, I could really see a situation that was similar to what happened with Pierre. Pierre Gasly was promoted from the Red Bull junior team to Red Bull, and then Alex Albon took his seat at the junior team, and midway through the season, they did swap those drivers. Obviously, that did not work out great for Alex either, and both of those drivers ultimately left the Red Bull family, but we all know that a Red Bull seat does not mean that you are staying there all season. And to be quite honest, as we saw last year, no seat at any team is actually a guarantee of finishing the season. So I do think that that is going to be one to watch. Key focuses for the rest of the season from this race: can Ferrari adjust their way of doing business to adjust to the new driver, as well as what Leclerc needs? Can McLaren make a decision and stick to it, and which of the two drivers will be prioritized? At what point is that prioritization necessary, and do we allow them to fight it out, or do we focus from the very beginning? Can Max Verstappen continue to challenge Oscar and Lando even in the current state of Red Bull, and which of the rookies are going to make the biggest splash? And lastly, following those midfield teams, because things are really shaking up, this may be the biggest opportunity for Lando Norris in particular to win a World Drivers' Championship. McLaren objectively has the best car in the field right now, but next year everything changes with all of the new regulations. So if things do not go according to plan, we have no idea what happens in 2026. We have no idea which team has the best car. So I think the biggest question is, can Lando take advantage of the fact that right now that's what he has? And can he win his first Drivers' Championship? That will be the question throughout the rest of this season. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm so happy that we are back. If you noticed a slight shift in my voice throughout the episode, I am progressively getting sicker as I record this, but I hope that by the next time you hear me, it will not be nasally at all. If you want to include your hot takes, predictions, or thoughts for the season when we do these sections of the audience participation, you can submit all of those in a number of ways. First and foremost, if you are listening to this podcast on YouTube and you have questions about this race or just about Formula One in general, you can leave your questions in the comments down below. If you're listening to this podcast elsewhere, you can always go to YouTube and ask those questions. You can also see some of the behind the scenes, especially as I start to travel to races this year. You will see me at least 2. You can also find me on social media. I am at Marissa Kamari on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. On Instagram stories after the race, I always ask you for your questions and your hot takes there. And last but not least, you can join the Grid Chat server. We use the Grid Chat server to watch the races together. It's a great way to make new friends and not watch the races alone, especially on weird time zones. We also obviously answer questions, share hot takes, and go through different announcements throughout the week. If you want to join that, you can find the link in the episode description down below, and I'd love to hear from you on any of those platforms. Next week, we are racing in China, and not only is Formula One racing, but F1 Academy is racing too. So stay tuned, and I will see you for the next race recap.